Section 14 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Carolyn Power. The side of the neck presents a somewhat quadrilateral outline, limited above by the lower border of the body of the mandible and an imaginary line extending from the angle of the mandible to the mastoid process, below by the upper border of the clavicle, in front by the middle line of the neck, behind by the anterior margin of the trapezius. This space is subdivided into two large triangles by the sternocleidomastoideus, which passes obliquely across the neck from the sternum and clavicle below to the mastoid process and occipital bone above. The triangular space in front of this muscle is called the anterior triangle, and that behind it the posterior triangle. Anterior triangle. The anterior triangle is bounded in front by the middle line of the neck, behind by the anterior margin of the sternocleidomastoideus. Its base, directed upward, is formed by the lower border of the body of the mandible, and a line extending from the angle of the mandible to the mastoid process. Its apex is below, at the sternum. This space is subdivided into four smaller triangles by the digastricus above and the superior belly of the omohyoideus below. These smaller triangles are named the inferior carotid, the superior carotid, the submaxillary, and the suprahyoid. The inferior carotid or muscular triangle is bounded in front by the median line of the neck from the hyoid bone to the sternum, behind by the anterior margin of the sternocleidomastoideus, above by the superior belly of the omohyoideus. It is covered by the integument superficial fascia, platysma, and deep fascia, ramifying in which are some of the branches of the supraclavicular nerves. Beneath these superficial structures are the sternohyoideus and the sternothyroideus, which, together with the anterior margin of the sternocleidomastoideus, conceal the lower part of the common carotid artery. Footnote: Therefore, the common carotid artery and the internal jugular vein are not, strictly speaking, contained in this triangle, since they are covered by the sternocleidomastoideus, that is to say, they lie under that muscle which forms the posterior border of the triangle. But as they lie very close to the structures which are really contained in the triangle, and whose position it is essential to remember in operating on this part of the artery, it is expedient to study the relations of all these parts together. End footnote. This vessel is enclosed within its sheath, together with the internal jugular vein and vagus nerve. The vein lies lateral to the artery on the right side of the neck, but overlaps it below on the left side. The nerve lies between the artery and vein, on a plane posterior to both. In front of the sheath are a few descending filaments from the ansa hypoglossae. Behind the sheath are the inferior thyroid artery, the recurrent nerve, and the sympathetic trunk, and on its medial side, the esophagus, the trachea, the thyroid gland, and the lower part of the larynx. By cutting into the upper part of this space and slightly displacing the sternocleidomastoideus, the common carotid artery may be tied below the omohyoideus. The superior carotid or carotid triangle is bounded behind by the sternocleidomastoideus, below by the superior belly of the omohyoideus, and above by the stylohyoideus and the posterior belly of the digastricus. It is covered by the integument superficial fascia, platysma, and deep fascia, ramifying in which are branches of the facial and cutaneous cervical nerves. Its floor is formed by parts of the thyrohyoideus, hyoglossus, and the constrictors pharyngis medius and inferior. This space, when dissected, is seen to contain the upper part of the common carotid artery, which bifurcates opposite the upper border of the thyroid cartilage into the external and internal carotid. These vessels are somewhat concealed from view by the anterior margin of the sternocleidomastoideus, which overlaps them. The external and internal carotids lie side by side, the external being the more anterior of the two. The following branches of the external carotid are also met with in this space: the superior thyroid running forward and downward, the lingual directly forward, the external maxillary forward and upward, the occipital backward, and the ascending pharyngeal directly upward on the medial side of the internal carotid. The veins met with are the internal jugular, which lies on the lateral side of the common and internal carotid arteries, and veins corresponding to the above-mentioned branches of the external carotid, viz., the superior thyroid, the lingual, common facial, ascending pharyngeal, and sometimes the occipital, all of which end in the internal jugular. The nerves in this space are the following. In front of the sheath of the common carotid is the ramus descendens hypoglossae. The hypoglossal nerve crosses both the internal and external carotids above, curving around the origin of the occipital artery. Within the sheath, between the artery and vein, and behind both, is the vagus nerve. Behind the sheath, the sympathetic trunk. On the lateral side of the vessels, the accessory nerve runs for a short distance before it pierces the sternocleidomastoideus, and on the medial side of the external carotid, just below the hyoid bone, may be seen the internal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve, and still more inferiorly, the external branch of the same nerve. The upper portion of the larynx and lower portion of the pharynx are also found in the front part of this space. The submaxillary or digastric triangle corresponds to the region of the neck immediately beneath the body of the mandible. It is bounded above by the lower border of the body of the mandible and a line drawn from its angle to the mastoid process, below by the posterior belly of the digastricus and the stylohyoideus, in front by the anterior belly of the digastricus. It is covered by the integument, superficial fascia, platysma, and deep fascia, ramifying in which are branches of the facial nerve and ascending filaments of the cutaneous cervical nerve. Its floor is formed by the mylohyoideus, hyoglossus, and constrictor pharyngis superior. It is divided into an anterior and a posterior part by the stylomandibular ligament. The anterior part contains the submaxillary gland, superficial to which is the anterior facial vein, while embedded in the gland is the external maxillary artery and its glandular branches. Beneath the gland, on the surface of the mylohyoideus, are the submental artery and the mylohyoid artery and nerve. The posterior part of this triangle contains the external carotid artery ascending deeply in the substance of the parotid gland. This vessel lies here in front of and superficial to the internal carotid, being crossed by the facial nerve, and gives off in its course the posterior auricular, superficial temporal, and internal maxillary branches. More deeply are the internal carotid, the internal jugular vein, and the vagus nerve, separated from the external carotid by the styloglossus and the stylopharyngeus, and the glossopharyngeal nerve. Footnote: the remark made about the inferior carotid triangle applies also to this one. The structures enumerated as contained in its posterior part lie, strictly speaking, beneath the muscles which form the posterior boundary of the triangle, but as it is very important to bear in mind their close relation to the parotid gland, all these parts are spoken of together. End footnote. The suprahyoid triangle